I have immense pleasure to introduce you, Alex, to our audience on this topic. And this is one more of the series of webinars brought to all of you by Upshot.ai. And we'll talk about Upshot for about 20 seconds in the whole 1 hour. That's my promise. The rest of all of it is going to be for Alex. And Alex, feel free to introduce yourself and tell all of us what you do, where you live, what do you like to do, and then we can kick off the topic.
Yeah, thank you. Well, look, yes, different part of the country. Thanks, Casey. It's look, absolute pleasure to be here. And this is truly a topic that I'm very, very passionate about, and that's behavior change. And, Casey, I'm looking forward to bouncing a few ideas with you today. And look, we're going to go through a few slides first, and hopefully that'll give you a bit of an idea of what gamification is for starters and how we actually use it. But then I'm very interested to start to dive into the detail with you, Casey, and really understand how it can be applied and help affect user behavior. So that'll be really fun. No, look, my background was actually not for profit. I grew up studying a Bachelor of Health Sciences. I loved the not-for-profit, the charity space, and I worked in senior management within that area for some time. And I love talking to people. I love that. So I actually volunteer with TEDx, for those of you who know what that is. And I was on stage one day, and Kirsten, who specializes in gamification as well, she's done a PhD on it. Kirsten was sat down the front row, and we had coffee afterwards. And I said, look, I have to be a part of this world. This gamification space and behavior change space is something phenomenal and really, really interesting that I have to be a part of. So I started working with Kirsten and her team, and that's now led me to where I am today at ThinkPlace. I'm based in Canberra in Australia. And I apply gamification and behavioral design into every walk of life. Last year, I think I was in a project in Switzerland. We're working with the World Wildlife Fund on how we can apply gamification to nature conservation. And then on the flip side, we're also here in Australia working on various SaaS products as well, and how gamification can be applied. So such a broad area, and I hope I can dive into that a bit further today. Look, unless you had anything else, Casey, I'm more than happy to take us through some slides.
Yeah, feel free to go ahead, Alex. Thank you so much. Yeah.
All right. Well, look, in the spirit of gamification and having a bit of fun and using our imaginations, which hopefully you can pick up throughout this, is definitely one of my passions. I'd love you all to take out your phone. Now, I can't see or hear anything from you, so I'm just going to trust that you're there in the background doing that. So take out your phone. I'd love you to go into your contacts or your call list and just pick out one of the last, let's say, 3 people that have called you. And then I want you to pick out the last 4 digits of that person. And I want you to remember those last 4 digits backwards. So I'm just going to give you a few seconds to do that. Go to your call list, pick out the last person who called you, and remember the last 4 digits backwards. Okay, so once you've done that, I want you to put your phone away, face down, nothing else. And Casey, just for the sake of bouncing here, I'm going to ask you, can you tell me what the last 4 digits were, please?
So it was 0083.
Fantastic. Can you now tell me exactly what the time was?
The time was 10:47.
Oh, you're on it. Yeah. Can you tell me who the second to last person was that called you?
It's a friend of mine, Vaishali. She lives in Mumbai.
There you go. Okay, you're all across it. Now, typically, when I get a typical response, the response is I don't know. Now, we have obviously just kicked off pretty much on the dot, so it might be very obvious. But what I'm trying to convey here is that we all have a certain amount of information available to us at any one time, and our brain can only comprehend a certain amount of information. Okay, we can't remember a huge amount of things. So what we need to recall and remember is when we're designing for people, it needs to be simple, and we can't be expecting them to recall all this information all at once. It needs to be really straightforward. Now, there are so many other activities that can sort of show those concepts and the biases that we bring in every single day. But it's really important when we're designing that we understand at the end of the day, this is for people. And if people can't navigate these things really simply, it's not going to work. So yeah, it's just a really interesting little activity. And there's quite a few of those to identify the biases. And I encourage you, have a bit of a Google and see what you can find, because they're very, very interesting and insightful to see how people actually respond under certain circumstances. So that takes me on to the next piece on understanding not user behavior, as we can see we've crossed out, but human behavior, because at the end of the day, it is people that we are actually dealing with. So behavioral science, just to give you a bit of an idea, behavioral science gives us the structure, the methodology, and the vocabulary to better understand, predict, and shift behavior. So behavioral science, behavioral design is this broad spectrum. And what I want you to picture is that gamification sits under one single part of that. Okay, behavioral science is actually quite broad and dives into a lot of different things. Gamification is one of the tools, one of the mediums that we can apply in that. So what I want to do is just give you a couple of examples of taking that behavioral science lens, and then we can look at what gamification actually teaches us from then on. Perfect. There's two models that I'd love to touch on first. And the first one is Fogg's behavior model. And basically it's saying that for a behavior to occur, for someone like myself to perform a certain behavior, I have to have a prompt, I have to have the motivation and the ability to perform that behavior. Now, one of the easiest ways that I can explain this is actually through another example. So Casey, hopefully you can help me here. And I'm going to use the example of a phone call, right? So I want you to imagine that you're in a lecture theatre and you get a phone call, but you don't want to answer that phone. Can you give me one excuse why you might not answer that call? Any excuse in the world.
Maybe I'm really interested. I'm into the topic going on.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is on point for a motivation, right? So I'm not motivated to pick up that phone because it's elsewhere. Okay. Now, I asked this question once before and someone gave me a beautiful answer and I absolutely loved it. And they said, I wouldn't answer the phone if I was on the way to the moon. I wouldn't have any cell reception. Fantastic. I love the imagination. Fantastic. Look, that then comes down to an ability, right? It might be not necessarily on the way to the moon, but I am somewhere on this planet that doesn't have cell reception. My phone might have died. There are a number of reasons. That's the ability, right? So it doesn't matter how strong the prompt is, doesn't matter how loud the phone call is or how much I want to answer that. If the ability isn't there, it's not going to happen. And all Fogg's behavior model is telling us is that we have to have a really clear prompt, a spark, a facilitator to actually initiate something. We have to want to perform that behavior, and we have to have the physical ability to do that. And there's a few examples on the side, right? It might be time, money, physical effort, cognitive load. Do I actually understand how to perform the task? So it's a really interesting model. And again, probably a more behavioral design lens, so that broader picture, but it applies in gamification as well. If we want someone to perform a behavior, even if it's on our phone and it's on an application, to perform a behavior, we have to satisfy each of these three things. Now, again, going even broader, again, 3 levels of architecture, choice architecture that I want to highlight. Now, I'm sure you can think of examples of this, right? But all this is saying decision information. What it is information that can help educate the user and allow them to make an informed decision, right? Many, many marketing campaigns are built around this, right? I'm going to give you some information, and based on that information, you should be able to make your own decision. Okay, that's all well and good, but how effective is that really? We then have decision assistance, which is interventions that reinforce self-regulation. Now, Casey, I asked you before, and you said everyone in this call is going to know many gamification examples, such as Duolingo or, all the many fitness apps that are out there, yeah? That's exactly what that is, decision assistance. It's intervention, right? So I've got vibrations, I've got notifications, nudges that are going to reinforce self-regulation. It's things that I already want to do. I know that I want to get fitter. I know that I need to stand up and move around. It's going to support that decision. And then lastly, decision structure. So research shows that this is probably one of the most effective in certain circumstances. And it's really important that we understand context applying these as well. right? But it's looking at the physical infrastructure and the built environment around us and how that supports our decision-making process. One of the easiest ways I can explain this is looking at organ donation in various countries. Now, in countries where the organ donation is automatically ticked, I don't have to do anything, there is something along the lines of 60%, 30%, 60% higher uptake of organ donation in comparison to countries that don't. So decision structure is creating a physical environment that makes it so easy. It reduces the cognitive load for me. I don't have to do any thinking. It's already there. Okay. It's still transparent. I know what's in front of me, but I don't have to physically tick that box. And it might sound simple, but the research shows us how much that actually helps us. So there are two models that I might just highlight.
So Alex, can I ask you a question around the decision structure, the one that you mentioned?
Yeah.
Is that what we would call as a default in the language of user interface or user experience?
Absolutely.
Pre-selecting the default and then also giving people the choice to switch out of it if they like.
Yeah, absolutely. That choice to switch out of it is crucial. Like when we talk about gamification and ethics, the transparency and freedom of choice is really high on that. So absolutely, I need to be able to get out of it. But default is absolutely one of the examples in that. And it is the example actually that they gave in this research paper. It's funny, there's also other papers that look at these levels of choice architecture. And there's different theories on that. Depending on the context, a combination of these are actually better suited versus others. So one of the most important things I want to convey today, I would say, is actually that it comes down to people and the context and scope of what you're applying. Certain circumstances, it might be better in one scenario than another. And one of the most important things is that we ask those questions. We do the user testing, the research, those sorts of things.
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. And then lastly, just understanding that, again, as people, we each have a different perspective of how we view the world around us, right? We engage in very different ways. We see different people. We experience different things. And that then leads to a series of inherent biases that influence how we make our decisions throughout the day that we might not necessarily be aware of. So as a designer, whether we're in creative design such as myself, or you're an app designer or a UX designer, we have to understand that people are going to come at this from different perspectives. And that's really important to understand, well, what are those perspectives? What are those biases that they bring? And then more importantly, how can I build something that suits that particular cohort? Or it might be a broader sense, a broader set of people, and how can we build something that meets all of their needs?
Right. Alex, do we also, is it also fair to join along with we engage with different people, we live in different places. Can I also add that we all as users ourselves of so many products out there, mobile apps and whatnot, we also experience a lot of products out there, right? Which also can create a sort of bias. We might expect the 51st product to somehow function like the rest 50. Does that make sense, or is it off the mark?
No, 100%. We can. Anything that we experience in our day-to-day affects the way we behave tomorrow. And right. Yeah, you're right. If we do have 52 apps that function in a certain way that we expect, that then becomes what we expect from the next product. Now, you can say that's right or wrong or however you want to phrase it. But ultimately, if I'm a designer, I need to understand that and build for that. Because if right. I'm not hitting the mark, am I? Like, regardless of what I think is right, if a user is expecting a certain type of service, a certain quality of service, or a certain quality of product, if I'm not meeting that mark, well, then there's a gap there in expectation.
Right. Even if those apps are from completely different industries, I would imagine still they create certain patterns in the mind, right? Even if, let's say, you're used to using a fintech app from Google. In India we have something called Google Pay, which millions of people use to make payments. Even though that's from the world of fintech and banking, I think it still impacts when you go into a different domain, I think still people will have a benchmark, let's say, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But all these amazing apps function so smoothly, so we expect the same when we go to our own domain, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I can certainly talk from experience of looking through product reviews of companies that I've worked with, and even as a startup, it can be quite challenging because obviously you need to prototype, you need to work with something at the beginning, but even in the playtesting phase, where we frame it to the audience and say that, look, this is a first initial trial of this. You're our first play testers. We want to hear what you think. It's funny, they can be incredibly critical straight up off the bat because it's not meeting a certain expectation or mark. So you're right. You're absolutely right. And again, all I can say is that it's up to us as designers to understand some of those expectations. But, it's almost moving away from biases and talking about, what are the expectations that people bring to the table. But,
right.
On the flip side of that, as designers, we can also, show our expertise and be proactive about other areas, other market areas to go, well, look, they're actually doing it really well in the banking sector in this particular mechanic that they're applying. It hasn't been used here. The audience might not know that they want it, but I'm going to trial it. So look, again, that's a whole nother, Casey, that's a whole nother question. Right?
Yeah, of course.
We can dive into that. But going back to your initial point, you're absolutely right. We bring our own set of inherent biases and expectations to the table based on what we use day to day. I'm going to keep moving through. So when do we get to play with games? Well, I tell you, it's actually not that simple. Now, gamification, I'm going to jump straight in. Gamification is the use of game mechanics and experience design to engage users and solve real-world problems. So the term gamification doesn't mean that we have to throw a game into every single opportunity that we find, right? It's not the physical game itself. It's using the mechanics, the things that we would normally find in games, whether it be a desktop game, a board game, whether it's a video game, points, badges, leaderboards, those very standard mechanics that you might find. And it's applying those things in a really strategic way in the real world. And I think, that's why we're here today, is to understand, well, how can we actually apply gamification to engage users in a different way? Create something that's innovative, engaging, and actually brings them into an experience that's different from what they normally would. Perhaps they're gamers, perhaps they're not. But either way, we're trying to engage users in a different way from what they normally would on a product.
Right.
So why gamification? Well, look, it's based on behavioral psychology. There are a lot of different theories and models that fall into gamification and how we actually apply it. So self-determination theory, autotelic flow, positive psychology, behavioral economics. There's many, many more and a lot of research that's been done that actually comes into how we apply gamification. So it is based on behavioral psychology and research. And it's our job as designers to make educated and really strategic decisions about how we apply these different models to achieve that engagement, that outcome that we're actually aiming for. So we can we can look at all these models and interpret them in our own way, right? But at the end of the day, we need to understand what is the research telling us and how can we apply that in a way that makes sense for our context and the people that we're designing for.
Right.
Now, all good. How do we design a gamification initiative that actually helps trigger these behavior changes in your users, right? So it's all well and good to understand how behavioral design and, where it's all come from, those sorts of things. But if you can't actually take anything away from this, well, then we've probably done you wrong, right? So what we want to do is probably just explain at a very high level, what are some of the design decisions, the gamification decisions that you actually have to make and explore. And hopefully that'll give you a high level understanding of the types of questions you need to be asking. And then Casey, let's jump into a bit of a deeper line of questioning and hopefully we can get a bit of engagement in that way. So the first thing I want to touch on, right, is that there's this continuum of playfulness. We work on this spectrum. All of this is a bit of a spectrum, right? It's not black and white. We need to tailor it for the context. So on the far end, we've got play, right? And I want you to imagine like a Lego brick. If I give you a set of Lego bricks, you can do whatever you want with that. There's no rules to that. As soon as we start moving up that spectrum, we then have games, physical board games. We've applied a set of rules, and the way we interact with that game is very different from a set of Lego bricks. We can then continue up that path where the gamification concepts, the gamification mechanics that we're applying are very, very different. And that's when serious games start coming into play as well. Now, when I say serious games, I'm talking games that have a real purpose, okay? It might be to recruit army personnel. It's a very common explanation used over in the US, right, to how serious games work. It's recruiting participants to come and join the military. Another example might be, how do we educate people on the impact of climate change at the moment? We might use a serious game that helps convey true concepts and learning and teachings to people that play those games. And then as we continue to move up, we've got content gamification and structural. I'm going to reword that. I'm going to call that behavioral gamification. Right? But content gamification is, think about a learning management system that you've perhaps been through. You might be a character, you kind of go through this little journey map, you pick up things along the way. That's content gamification. It's making the content itself quite playful, quite fun, quite visual. And then we have, as we continue to move up that scale, we've got structural gamification or behavioral gamification. And that's more to the level where we're using those mechanics that we find in everyday games and applying them into real world circumstances, to the point that you might not necessarily know it's gamification. Think about things like your credit card and the reward points that you have there. Mm-hmm. That could be gamification. It's using gamification concepts in there, but we might not necessarily tie that back to gamification at the end of the day. Nevertheless, that's, it's the type of concepts that we're using. We then have understanding motivations of people, right? This is based on a few different theories, but ultimately we are stronger in maybe 2 or 3 of these particular motivations. Purpose, right, on a higher order. So people who are very driven by climate change or family or whatever it might be very high in this motivational area. And what's important to understand is that each of these key areas then have a set of dynamics and mechanics that make more sense for that user group. To give an example, over in the mastery section, right, I want to achieve something. I want to be top of the ladder. I want to be top of the leaderboard. Exactly that. That's when we start to apply gamification mechanics such as leaderboards, badges, points, all those sorts of things. But on the flip side, if I relate more to a motivation, social connection or relatedness, well, then the mechanics that I should be engaging with are things that connect me with other people, that allow me to really engage with other people in different parts of my community and create a sense of identity within that community as well. And the same can be said for all of these different areas. But it's important that we understand, again, the people that we're designing for, where do they fit? What motivates them to their core? Why are they engaging with your product, right? Is it because they want to change the planet? They want to change their behaviors and reduce their carbon footprint? Well, then we need to understand the mechanics that fall under that. Again, is it basic? I just need to work my fitness up. I need to save money, those sorts of things, whatever it might be. Well, then we might change those mechanics again.
Right. I think this one looks really critical, Alex, right? We have to understand this kind of a need map, maybe for lack of a better term. We have to really, really understand what our people need. And it's not so much as what we want to give them, but it's what they really are looking to get out of that product, right? Yeah.
Look, sometimes things like budget and scope come into play here with, what we have available to give in a product. But I'm going to keep reiterating this main point. Absolutely, it is about the people that we're designing for. And if we're not meeting that basic need, then that's when we start receiving low engagement in certain areas, right? It doesn't matter how many gamification mechanics we apply. If it's not applied in the right way, we're still not going to get results. And that can be quite disheartening. If we're putting in certain mechanics into an application and we're expecting higher engagement, but it's not working, that's when we really start to ask the question, well, is it the right game mechanic for that target audience? And why have we chosen to put that mechanic in? Really important questions to ask in that design process.
Right.
And I suppose sort of to build on that, right? This little diagram here builds on that to a much greater extent. We have the motivations and goals in the bottom sort of left-hand corner there that you can see. But there's all these other things that we need to understand from the user's perspective. Demographics is a very easy one for us to understand. We can typically get the demographics of our target audience relatively easily, right?
Right.
But then we need to understand, well, what are the challenges and the pain points that they experience every single day? It's no good that we build a seamless experience for someone who doesn't have enough money to buy credit or have internet access on their phone to actually use that product. If it's too heavy on data, and I need to save data, well, I'm simply not even going to engage. And that then goes back to Fogg's behavior model, right? Do we satisfy each of those three things, the trigger, the ability, and the motivation?
Right.
It's really important to dive into in the design process before we even build anything to actually understand the audience to a really finite degree, and then build a product that is very targeted and suited to that audience or group of audience personas, I can say, I suppose. Yeah.
Right.
And now there's just a couple of extra slides here, and I think we've got four slides to finish off with here, and I want to breeze through these just to give you an overview. But we want to understand who and what are we designing for, the level of playfulness. We want to understand the scale of what we're working with. Is it a small community, a country? Is it on a global scale? The platform that we're applying, and then the gameplay pattern, which is how all of these things fit in together. And that I suppose is demonstrated here, right? We understand the motivations. We've got the mechanics that fit into all these gears, right? We've got this user journey and the mechanics fit into certain aspects of that user journey to increase engagement in a particular way. We have a narrative, we have a theme that sort of sits overarching across this whole topic as a concept, and the dynamics, how the mechanics actually interact with each other, right? The points and badges and leaderboards are separate mechanics, but we want to understand what's the interrelation between those mechanics and how is that going to affect how someone might engage with it. And at the end of the day, as silly as it might sound, we need to have a win state. What's someone actually aiming for? If I don't have a goal, if I don't have something to aim for, to strive for, I'm going to have no motivation to do that. There's a lot of research as well, Casey, and maybe that's something that, I can encourage you all to have a look at later. But there's a lot of research on how goals actually increase our motivation and how important that is to incorporate into any service delivery, any application that we're actually building for someone.
Right.
And then there's these last two slides, and I'm actually going to finish on that, right? So nudging behavior ethically. People need to actually understand that we're doing it for legitimate ends, right? We're nudging for good. It's no good that we're trying to nudge behavior if it's, a very typical example that's used is gambling and slot machines, right? If we're using nudging and we're using gamification for those purposes, it's not for good. It's not keeping to the core principles that we need to be following. It can't violate any of my individual rights as a human, okay? It can't go against my values. Again, if it's going against my values, I'm simply not going to use the product. Now, the nudges, we cannot take things from people without their consent. And now, just to reiterate, when I say nudging, gamification, behavioral design, I'm using those terms quite broadly right now. And it must be transparent. I have to understand what is happening in front of me. Like I said with the default example, we're not trying to hide it in fine print down the bottom. It needs to be clear as day in front of me, and I need to have the opportunity to opt out of that. And at the end of the day, all of these things must respect my values, the things that I hold dear to myself and the way that I live my life. Because again, if it's not doing that, and there's things that are a little iffy for me, it's going to affect my motivation to actually want to perform and participate within that behavior. And then finally, I just wanted to finish, Casey, on some guiding principles, and then, let's dive into a bit of conversation and explore some things a little further. But a gamification concept needs to be fair and genuine. It needs to be inclusive. It needs to be open for anyone to actually be involved. And I can't feel manipulated. I can't, if I've got notifications or nudges always telling me to do something, and I'm like, no, I don't really want to do that. Again, it's gonna pull me away from that experience. Transparency, it's the same as I said before, right? We need to be really clear about what we're doing. We don't necessarily have to explain, we are using gamification and, you should expect this. No, we don't even have to use that word. All we have to do is, we are, how about you follow this prompt for X, Y, Z reason? It just needs to be clear why I'm doing something. As opposed to, something randomly popping up telling me to follow this path without any context or anything at all. We need checks and balances. We need to understand, well, at the end of the day, we might have a year on a leaderboard, but, we want it to be fair for people joining consistently. So maybe we want to put in a reset button at the end of the year, or maybe it's end of a month, end of a week. But we put in those checks and balances to consistently check in and see, well, where's it up to? Is it fair for everyone that's involved? And then the last three things, gameplay experience, a balanced game design. It needs to cater for different audiences. As far as building for a particular persona is important, it's really crucial that we understand our audience. We also need to understand the broader context of people and how they're going to engage with the product. We need to play test it. We need to know, does this work? We actually need to put it in the hands of people who are going to use this product at the end of the day. It's so funny when we're engaged, when we're building something, we're so entranced in how we think people want to engage with that product. And it's actually not until we give it to the final user that we understand we actually missed the mark, or we need to change these things slightly. And I guess, a final thing is accessibility. Is it accessible to lots of different people? Are we putting limitations, because of our biases? Are we putting limitations up that we might not actually know about? So I might leave it there, Casey, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that, we can talk. But hopefully that's given people a bit of an intro to gamification. And I say that very strongly. It is by all means an introduction. And there's so much research that you can actually dive into. And hopefully you can see I'm very passionate about it. And I could talk on it for a long time. For the audience, I had a slide deck that was probably 3 times this length. In case said, no, we're not going to get through any of that in this time. So hopefully that's given you an overview. And by all means, let's continue the conversation.
And Alex, we have, meanwhile, while you were showing us the slides, we got some top class questions in the Q&A section. So I'm going to put my questions aside, and I'm going to take a few of the ones from the audience because they took the trouble to articulate them. So let's give them an applause and answer their questions. And I think the first question that I want to talk about is from Shivaram, and he says that how do we use gamification to drive a behavior that's not a pain point today? Because the example he gives is we ignore important nutrition practices till we are ill. And similarly, we all want to save money, but we don't invest in learning to invest. Right. So I think his question is a very, very significant question because this falls under what I call gamification for good or gamification for greater good. So what's your quick take on this question of how do we use gamification to drive behavior that is not yet a pain point?
Yeah, it's very interesting. And that, I suppose it comes down to the motivation, right? If I'm not motivated to do something, I'm not going to do it. The examples you've given are very good, and I'm actually going to elaborate a little on that. And I'm going to draw it back to the 3 levels of choice architecture theory that I explained before. Now,
Right.
as far as nutritional information goes, if I give you a pamphlet, Casey, and I tell you, you need to walk every single day for X amount of time, you need to be eating a wide variety of fruit and vegetables, and you probably need to cut down on your meat. Okay, I'm looking at your diet here. It's pretty high. But all the information's on this pamphlet. I want you to take that pamphlet home. If I told you that today, what would you do with that pamphlet? Where would you put it?
Probably completely ignore that, put it aside, dispose it off.
But it's funny, isn't it? That's the approach that particularly government, funnily enough, government use a lot. And often we think that, if we educate a user in a particular way, they're going to perform that behavior, when
Right.
often it's simply not the case, right? And that's where we start to bring in gamification. And there's some really good examples. One that I might refer to is Jewel Bug. Now, unfortunately, I can't see from the audience, but I don't know, Casey, have you heard of Jewel Bug before?
No, I haven't.
So Jewel Bug looks at your carbon footprint and how you can actually reduce those behaviors. Now, within that application, there's a lot of information there, which is fantastic. But it then creates certain behaviors, things that you can physically do to reduce your carbon footprint. Now, that is coupled with various leaderboards and badges that award you for performing consistent behaviors to achieve that final goal. So in answer to your question, we ignore nutritional practices. Yeah, we absolutely do. But if we start to apply certain gamification mechanics based on the people that are using it, and we understand that, well, there are certain barriers that are coming forward. When we're talking to people, we understand there's certain barriers. And one of those barriers might be, look, I simply don't have the time. It's probably one of the most used things that I could say, right? I don't have the time to cook dinner and all this, it's just not practical. There's a beautiful book, and I'm having an absolute mental blank at the moment. But it's something along the lines of micro habits, and the title will come back to me, and we'll be on a different
Atomic Habits.
Thank you. Atomic Habits is a beautiful explanation.
I love that book. Yeah.
And one I would very much recommend you read. Now, the theory in Atomic Habits says that, well, look, it can actually be quite challenging to commit to a 2K run every single day. But physically, by placing our shoes, by placing our clothes at the foot of the bed, so as soon as we step out of bed, it's the first thing we see, and we're only going to commit to a 2-minute walk. We have to get out the door, and we start with atomic micro habits that then develop and develop and develop. So likewise, bringing it back to an application here, we want to create small, achievable nudges that are actually quite easy to perform, that contribute to my overall goal at the end of the day. Again, bringing it back to motivation, creating a win state, a goal for them to chase, and making sure that these habits, these behaviors that we want people to do are not too big. I'm not asking someone to go to on a 5K run straight off the bat. I'm providing them with micro behaviors that they can perform regularly. They can form a habit, and that is more important than telling them to do something up front. And what was the other example? Money. And I did want to highlight this. The same research paper that spoke about the 3 levels of choice architecture, I believe I linked it in the slides, but we can do this. I can send the information later. It actually talks about the fact that behavioral design, gamification, it works to a certain degree. As soon as something is going to have a major impact on my life, i.e. finances, if I'm spending money, that is a much higher risk for me personally when I look at that than it is for me to, spend my time, for example, something like that. So as soon as we start to enter areas such as in investing and finances and those sorts of things, using gamification and behavioral design becomes even trickier. It still works, but maybe not to the same degree in other areas. We have a larger commitment. If I feel that I have a large commitment to make, again, it's going to reduce my want to actually perform those behaviors.
Right. Perfect. And we have another question from Shomalaya. And the question is, when we are building a product, I would assume we already know that this product is what our target audience wants, and it solves one or more critical problems, because if it doesn't, then gamification as a mechanic can't really help it succeed. So would you say that gamification only serves to make the user journey more enjoyable and gets the product ahead of competitors? I think it's a phenomenal question.
It is a really good question. And I actually have a little quote that I wanted to share. And I'm gonna read it word for word. So there's a man by the name of Nathaniel Hashim, and he's a PhD candidate in gamification. So he's done some really interesting stuff, and I had the pleasure of working with him in a previous project. And I just want to give another definition of how he explained gamification. So again, I'm just going to read it verbatim here. Gamification is a psychological mechanism which motivates consumers or individuals to fulfill certain psychological motives that makes pursuing a behavior more immediately rewarding. So basically, we're gamifying certain behaviors to make it more immediately rewarding. We're trying to get that dopamine hit for that person, that they're going to, every single behavior they perform, they're going to feel that little excitement, that chasing feeling that they want to achieve something. Right. So slightly deviating, I suppose, from the question ever so slightly, but I'd go as far as saying that, no, it's not just about making it more enjoyable. It's actually trying to change and shift behavior of a user. Yes, when we're building a product, perhaps we do know what the audience is actually trying to solve and what they want. As long as we've done the research, the testing in that. But I would say don't underestimate it. It does play a significant value in the design process. Excuse me. It does play a significant value in the design process. And the behaviors that we're trying to change, going back to that particular definition, we're trying to change the motivation of the person to perform a certain behavior. And we're doing that by making it more enjoyable, more satisfying to perform it at that time.
Right. And I think one of the questions or / comments that I have to make on this is that when we say what users want or what people want, I think that umbrella is big enough to fit in some, like your Nathaniel Hashim's point, that umbrella is big enough to fit in even this whole psychological state. I want to feel good when using it. I want to feel empowered. I want to feel like I'm achieving something. So even those things are legitimate wants, although typically product designers or product owners might not exactly think in that way. They might be focused a lot more on the more KPI driven goals. The user stories, when they come up with, they say, well, as a user of this application, I want to be able to make a payment within 3 seconds, something very measurable, one of your SMART goals, specific, measurable. But I think the softer, for lack of a better word, the softer aspect of, well, I'm a person, I want to feel good. I want to feel like I'm being appreciated for using this platform and not your competitor platforms. So there is, I think, a certain psychological narrative which completely goes unserved or underserved, right?
And
I think,
Casey, you're reminding me of a really interesting point, and that is that gamification is only part of the solution here. We can't think that we're going to apply gamification and magically everything's going to change. You still need an incredible marketing team, right? They're experts in what they do. Try and get me as a marketer, and I can't tell you what user behavior does from a marketing perspective, right? But you then have the UX and the interface design. Again, I can support, and funnily enough, it's probably the wrong example because I have worked in that space, but a lot of other people, you can't specialize in everything. So you need to understand that there are so many people that need to be a part of this conversation. Gamification is simply one little aspect of it. And, if we're talking about actually putting physical mini games into a product, well, then all of a sudden you want a game designer a part of your team as well. Keeping in mind that gamification is simply using those mechanics that you would find and trying to apply it to change and influence and shift someone's behavior. It's sometimes it can be tricky to get your mind past that definition of, gamification. It must be games, but realistically, we are playing with the mechanics specifically and applying them in a very strategic sense.
Right. Now, I want to move on to a topic which is on the top of mind for many people that we work with, which is that if you take maybe 4 or 5 years, you go back in time, you did not have, let's say, the most popular companies in the world use gamification. And all that has changed drastically in the last 4 to 5 years, especially people in the Indian ecosystem. You see Amazon apply gamification heavily in their mobile apps. They've got quizzes going on various features of Amazon, like, what are the benefits of Amazon Pay? Instead of teaching you, they're actually quizzing you, right? So that even if you make a mistake, you still end up learning something valuable about Amazon Pay. And Google, as I mentioned, Google got into the fintech space very heavily. They're one of the pioneers and leaders in India. Similarly, there are lots of other examples where now gamification seems to have gained currency, right? It's like the biggest companies of the world are putting their dollars behind gamification, and now everybody wants to do it, right? It's almost like if you don't want to do gamification, people might even think of you as a little, anachronistic. They're like, well, why aren't you trying it out? It's all the big companies are doing it. And this context actually brings in a very interesting question, where a lot of people now talk to us. They say, Upshot, help us gamify our product, help us gamify this experience, that behavior. What is your take on this urgency, right? Because in that urgency, I also sense a certain value judgment about gamification, that it's just like a skin on top of the app that they have built, right? It's because that's how I kind of have understood through many of these conversations. So do you feel, what's your advice, or what do you want to say to the product leaders that are listening to us today and in the future when we put this recording out? What do you want to say to them when they have this rush, or, this urgent desire to, just, for lack of a better word, go along the same lines as Google or Amazon and just quickly bring in gamification, quickly being the keyword?
Yeah. Look, it's really funny. 3 years ago, I can tell you from our experience at PenderQuest, 3 years ago, we still had clients jumping on, and the second we mentioned gamification, it was almost like a scary word. No, it's too playful. You're talking to a room of board members or executives, and they hear the word gamification, and it's, no, I don't want to touch that with a 10-foot pole. And then all of a sudden we change industry and we're in the digital space, and no, gamification is so exciting. How can we bring this into the boardroom? It's very interesting, the different industries, and I feel that they're at different stages. So it's, depending on the area that you play in, it might actually be in a different, it might be more prominent in certain areas, which is, an interesting thing. Now, as far as bringing gamification in quickly, it's funny when we have people come up and we've got $2,000 and we want to provide a gamification solution, and that's all I have. That's the only budget I have for it. I would almost say save your money and spend it elsewhere. Gamification, to work successfully, you actually do need to do that design process that I spoke about earlier. You need to dive into the motivations of your target audience, and you need to pick the mechanics, the particular gamification mechanics that work based on research that is going to work for that target audience. A quick gamification solution, you might be picking out mechanics that just have a fun element to them, right? Like, I love the look of that. everyone wants points, badges, leaderboards. So we're going to put points, badges, leaderboards in there. But if we do that without going through the design process, we might find that, well, my name's John and I'm not very good at this. And I sit at the bottom of this leaderboard all the time. And now I have no motivation to perform this behavior now, this task, or even be a part of my work, because at the end of the day, I know I'm going to sit at the bottom of the leaderboard. Nothing I can do is going to change that. So I'm going to completely give up. So we can actually have an adverse effect by implementing gamification without the right design decisions to begin with. So by all means, jump into it. People are obviously using it for a reason, right? It does improve engagement when done correctly. When done quickly, to quote you, Casey, when done quickly, you can actually have an adverse effect. And there are many examples of gamification mechanics being used and it not having the initial outcome that they might have thought. One of the best examples I'm going to give you is if we look at social media, Facebook and the bottomless scroll. Now, a really interesting Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma. And I think they actually talked to some of the people who designed these things at the beginning, right? And they quote, they said they never thought that this could have a negative impact on someone. But the bottomless scroll, every time I refresh or I continue scrolling and there's something new there, it's that chase. It's going back to the chemicals in our brain. It's the dopamine response. I want to see what's next. I want to see what's next. Now, when we don't think about some of those adverse consequences, we do have impacts. And we need to understand that we impact people's lives with the decisions. We're trying to change and shift behavior. That's changing the way someone's going to interact in their day-to-day. So there's a lot of responsibility that comes onto that.
Great. And one of my all-time favorite questions is the distinction between nudges, as you mentioned in gamification, and notifications. I think notifications, we all are victims of it. If I can feel free to use that word, the moment you switch on the internet, you're flooded with notifications from every app on your phone. What do you see is how do you help our audience understand the difference between a nudge and a notification? Because I think it's a critical difference to understand. And armed with that knowledge, I think a lot of our audience might go ahead and do things very differently and much better.
Yeah. The first thing I want to highlight there is Cass Sunstein is probably one of the pioneers of this. But Cass Sunstein's a behavioral economist, has done some incredible work in this space, has written many books, a lot of research papers in this area, and really pioneered, I suppose, the term nudge and what that actually means. And so to quote you exactly the way he explains this is a nudge when I'm walking through a supermarket and I have candy and chips and those sugary products that we're trying to get rid of. When I put those at eye level, that's a nudge. If I'm in a cafeteria and I'm walking through and the first thing that I see in the cafeteria line, the first thing I see is healthy, nutritional food. That is a nudge. By placing that food in front of me before the unhealthy food, I'm probably going to be more inclined. And again, I'm going to say that this is all backed with research and there's a lot of examples of how this has been applied. But I'm going to select probably more fruit and veg and healthy options than I would have if that was at the end, because then I'm going to fill my plate up with all the goodies that I like, right? I love ice cream, pizza. I'm going to go for all those things first. So a nudge is moving the physical environment around us, providing easy options for me to make a decision. Now, it does change slightly when we're looking at products, right? The difference between a nudge and a notification the line is a little hazy sometimes. But again, there's some really good diagrams that you can actually find online that sort of show a match either side, right? A notification is loud, it's annoying, it's frequent, it doesn't provide any value to me. On the other side of this, a nudge it's helping me. It's helping me perform a desired behavior that I would like to change. Notifications simply trying to spam me and get me to use a product frequently.
Right.
The nudge is about what's in my interest and making it very easy for me to perform that behavior. Again, going back to the cafeteria, I'm trying to make it easy for you to pick the healthy option over the unhealthy option. By where I place something, that's a nudge. If we maybe look at an interface, a nudge might be seen as strategically placing important information within the interface front and center and putting less important information down the bottom. Now, again, I can tell you I'm not a UX, I'm not a UI expert, but that's perhaps a way that you might approach what a nudge is versus what a notification is when it comes to app design.
Okay, that is very clear. And let's, because we are probably about 5 minutes to the end of this, I want to ask you a very important question that plays on the minds of a lot of product owners, which is, when I do decide to start a gamification project, what's best for me? Is it doing it with my in-house engineers and the staff, or is it also sometimes all right to look for platforms that have kind of put in some of these things as a readily available solution?
I love that question, Casey, because it opens a massive conversation, and really it does come down to the context and the scope that you have available to you. Now, if I have an endless budget, I would 9 times out of 10 out of 10, I would say go in-house, right? Because you then have or a contractor, an expert, right? And I'm going to tell you why. I would go a contractor expert, and because you might not always be an expert in gamification or how to apply that, right? So as much as you want to go in-house, a contractor is a really good option to get the expertise that you need to build the product. Right. In-house and contracting allows you to be incredibly close to the design yourself. You can make small adaptations that suits your particular audience.
Yep.
Based on whatever research you've done before. So personally, from what I've seen and what I believe, going with in-house and contracting services is a great way to do that. Now, on the flip side of things, there are a lot of fantastic products, off-the-shelf products that you can buy that already have a lot of research that have done, and they've got proven results. So they're also fantastic options to go with, but you need to be picking it for your context. If you pick an off-the-shelf product that meets 20% of what your users actually need, well, then it's not the right solution. So really, you do need to, again, come back to the scope, the context. What's the budget that you have to play with? Do you have an endless budget and then you've got, a magical person on the side that's giving you endless cash? Well, fantastic. Go in-house, get the expertise you need, build it exactly the way you want to build it. But just sometimes that's not realistic. And, we do, particularly in non-government organizations, in charity, it's really important that we understand, well, not everyone can afford that level of design work. Right. So then it becomes, what products are available for us to hitch onto or to utilize? And then how can we incorporate our understanding and make minor tweaks or things to that? I think that's probably the simplest way I can answer it. But it's annoying because I'm not giving you a straight answer, but I truly think that it entirely depends on the context. And it is really important for us to understand that, we need to pick what's going to work for us. In-house contracting provides the expertise and the dynamic ability to change and adapt very, very quickly. Right. A lot of the background work has already been done in that final product if we go the other way. And that's incredibly valuable too.
Perfect. And any of the people who are attending today, if you are not aware of what Upshot.ai does, it's basically an off-the-shelf product which might be helpful to you if you are considering to implement gamification. But before you think of any product, including ours, I think you should follow the methodology that Alex is recommending, which is to think through the design decisions, think through what kind of audience you are building it for, And once everything is clear, if it makes sense, do look us up at www.upshot.ai. That's the website. And the last question, Alex, we are coming to the end of the webinar. It's an hour already.
Flew, didn't it? My goodness.
And well, let me see. I have a couple of interesting questions. Okay, you know what I would do? I will pick up a question from one of our audience, Mehmet uh, Akgun or Akjun. I'm really sorry if I get your name wrong, Mehmet. The question that you ask is, you mentioned, Alex, the question is for you. You mentioned about immediate rewarding. And so what type of rewards are better, intrinsic or extrinsic?
Yeah, it is a great question. I can tell you very, very quickly and easily, intrinsic reward is what we're aiming for. We want a balance. There always needs to be a balance. We understand that at the end of the day, extrinsic rewards is fantastic. We love money. We love physical things. That's us as humans, yeah? But extrinsic rewards, those physical things, that can expire, right? When I get something, I get that immediate reward. I get that dopamine hit that tells me, okay, I want to chase this thing. I've got it. But occasionally that can get boring. But more importantly, if I take that away all of a sudden, maybe because a change in funding or a change in the way we deliver a certain model,
Right.
if I get accustomed to that and we take that away, well, why on earth would I want to do that behavior? I'm not going to get the reward at the end of the day. So intrinsic reward is then when we need to apply something that meets the user motivation. So the things I was talking about before, the 7 needs, the 7 motivations that we have, or any other model that you want to apply. What we're trying to do is understand what motivates you internally and why do you come to work every day? What's important to you? And if we can address those needs, that's when we get a very, very powerful behavioral response and motivation from the user. And we don't even need to provide them with anything. It might simply be feedback. It might be live feedback that you are doing amazing. You're doing really well. And there's then no input from us other than information back to that user to say, here's what's happening. You're doing fantastic. Every single day you've done this and you've done this behavior. We might compare that to the community and you can say you're 20% up on what everyone else is achieving. You are making a true impact. Now, if I have a motivation as a purpose for me, right, I really want to make a difference in this environment and I want to change my behaviors. I might not necessarily need anything else other than a really, really clear idea that I'm making a true impact. And then maybe it might be a comparison. It might be, look, you are actually performing 20% better than everyone else in your community. See how you can bring your community with you. And then you might be motivated to drive everyone in your community to get a better result because you want to make a true impact. So 9 times out of 10, I would point you in the direction of intrinsic motivation. But know that there is still value to external motivators, and they are used very successfully as well. We want to find that balance, and we do want to try and get that intrinsic motivation going within the person. And that comes down to the design questions that we ask at the beginning and building something that's unique to that person.
Well, Alex, that brings us to the end of this conversation. And I think we've had some lovely, lovely questions from the audience today. It's very motivating for us to see, audience think through what you're saying and, pose really intelligent questions. And it's a pleasure to have you with us and wonderful to receive so much of knowledge from you. And I think you've been very free with your time. Thanks a lot for being with us. And thank